Hello, my name is Michael Cagle, Principal of Kennedale High School. Today I want to share part 3 of a presentation with our stakeholders regarding the TEA 2020-21 Principal Residency Grant for Cycle 3. The purpose of part 3 of this presentation is to examine the grant and KISD Principal Residency Program evaluation process and the role of the DEIC as the evaluative committee of the grant. In future parts of this presentation and at the KISD Principal Residency Program information meeting on April 24th, we will explore the residency design and experiences of the residency further. I should note that much of the program design and experiences will be developed in the coming months as the committee and university representatives collaborate and develop the residency program. This presentation is intended for informational purposes only and to provide a better background for our stakeholders, our district and campus leaders, and potential principal residents. Most of the contents of this presentation are directly from the grant application and the requirements that were laid out by TEA. However, I have provided some recommendations to district and campus leaders to assist in the initial launch of the grant, as district and campus leaders organize the overseeing committee of the grant. The KISD superintendent is Chad G, and the assistant superintendent is Dr. Julie Vu. Mr. G and Dr. Vu will lead our district's efforts in implementing and organizing the components of the grant. In parts 1 and 2 of this presentation, I shared some links with you. The first link at the top takes you to the TEA Grant Opportunities page. This is where you can find all the information related to the grant, including the grant requirements and attachments of the grant. For this presentation, I recommend that district and campus leaders refer to attachments 1 and 2 during the presentation. I'm going to examine these specific documents and their role in our evaluation process. It may be difficult for you to see the text in the documents in this video presentation. I recommend pausing this presentation and printing the attachments or having another way to reference them while you complete this presentation. In part 1 of the presentation, I discussed that the KISD Principal Resident Program Committee is responsible for overseeing the grant. When we wrote the grant, we wanted to have another group be responsible for evaluating the KISD Principal Resident Program to ensure that we meet the grant requirements and assurances with fidelity. The Kennedale ISD District Educational Improvement Committee is identified in the grant as the body that will conduct both formal and informal evaluations of the KISD Principal Residency Program. The DEIC will conduct formal quarterly evaluations of the residency program to evaluate and monitor progress towards program benchmarks and goals. The Kennedale ISD DEIC will work collaboratively with residents, site mentors, field supervisors, university staff, and the KISD Principal Resident Committee to collect data and to collect both informal and formal feedback to guide the evaluation process and to make modifications to the program. In the grant, we did say that KISD principal residents will serve terms on the DEIC during their residencies to facilitate communication between residents and program evaluators. I recommend that the DEIC look at the nomination process for the upcoming year and look to nominate those principal residents for the committee, at least for that one-year term. To guide the evaluation process, the KISD DEIC will use the benchmarks, goals, and the required grant performance measures of the Principal Residency Grant. Through the collaborative processes with the KISD Principal Resident Program Committee, field supervisors, site mentors, and residents, the DEIC will be able to then prescribe any program modifications or changes that need to be made. In future segments of this presentation, we will look more deeply into the residency design and the experiences that the residents will have through their master's program and on the job. But one of the things that I want to point out now is that principal residents will be required to maintain weekly logs of their activities and evaluate how these activities relate to the domains of the Texas Principal Certification Framework. The principal residents will have the opportunity to share their reflections through weekly meetings with site mentor and through their 6 formal and informal meetings with their field supervisors. These meetings, resident surveys, and analysis of field experiences will allow site mentors and field supervisors to recommend necessary program changes to the DEIC. The DEIC, site mentors, and field supervisors will use an inputs, activities, outputs, and effects model to identify root causes, to develop interventions for residents, and to prescribe program modifications in order to create a dynamic, responsive, and individual residency program for the principal residents and to ensure the program is sustainable for the duration of the grant cycle and beyond. Before I dive deeper into the role of the DEIC and the evaluation process, I want to stop and take note that the purpose of this presentation is to provide a basic framework for the DEIC and campus and district leaders. From this framework, it is the responsibility of the DEIC to develop the methods and processes they will use to evaluate the grant program. The main evaluation instruments that TEA has provided for this grant are attachments 1, 2, and 3. But beyond these rubrics, the DEIC must consider all of the grant performance measures, program goals, benchmarks, and other components of the grant in determining these best evaluation methods and processes. When designing and evaluating the grant, everyone needs to have the end in mind. At the end of the grant cycle, TEA has provided the grant performance measures which will be used to determine the relative success of the KISD Principal Resident Program. The grant performance measures, which I have here listed in gold, were listed by TEA in the guidelines for the Principal Residency Grant for Cycle 3. The KISD DEIC must use these grant performance measures for program evaluation purposes. The first grant performance measure that's listed is that the DEIC must use performance evaluation data on the principal residents, such as observations, teacher surveys, and coaching notes. So anyone that is responsible for any of those things, including our campus principals or the appraisers of our residents or the university faculty and staff, need to keep these for documentation when we get to the end of the grant cycle, and they must be provided to the DEIC for evaluation of this grant performance measure. Number 2, TEA is going to look at the post-residency placement information on all principal residents. One of the ways that TEA is going to judge the success of this grant cycle is to see if those residents at the end of their terms do receive administrative placements. The next item that they are going to look at TEA is number 3, the demographic information of principal residents. We will review in this presentation, as we did in prior presentations, that we do have a targeted recruitment goal, and TEA does want us to target and recruit candidates who mirror the diversity of our student body. When we make our hires, they are going to look at the demographic information to see if we met our program goal of having 3 of 5 or 60% of the residents be from our minority populations. Number 4, they are going to look at the residents' program completion rates. We did set a goal for this grant cycle that 100% of all of our residents would complete their programs and get their principal certification. Number 5, the residents are going to have some evaluative surveys and some other instruments where they will list their satisfaction rates or describe their satisfaction rates with the university and their mentor principals. And so the results of those surveys and those satisfaction rates will be weighed in our grant performance. Number 6, they're also going to look at the number of applicants we received for this principal residency program. I once again want to encourage all of our campus and district leaders. We did have a recruitment and nomination process, and I want them to continue those efforts, as the number of applicants will be one way that we judge the success of the program. Number 7, once residents take their principal certification test and other instruments that they will take, including the PASL, their resident certification test scores will be calculated and used in our grant performance measure. Number 8, a program self-evaluation must be done using attachments 2 and 3. Now, this is where I want to talk about the difference between attachments 2 and 3 briefly. Attachment 2 is one that the DEIC and Kennedale ISD need to look closely at. It is the one for LEAs, or local education agencies. That is us, that is KISD, and the DEIC will use attachment 2. We're going to dive deeper into attachment 2 and look at the different domains and the scoring criteria within attachment 2. But we are going to use that attachment to do our primary evaluation of this grant program, and then attachment 3 is going to be used by the EPP. Attachment 3 is very similar to attachment 2, but attachment 3 is designed for program evaluation by the university. And then finally, the residents are going to use those same attachments, attachments 2 and 3, and they are going to also do an individual evaluation of their experience and how we did with our program. But those are the 9 grant performance measures that were laid out by TEA. The primary evaluation rubric that's going to be used by Kennedale ISD campus and district leaders and the DEIC at the end of the grant cycle to evaluate the program and its effectiveness is attachment 2 of the grant. This is where I recommend that you have a printed copy or a version of attachment 2 so that you can read the text and follow along as we go through the rest of this presentation. When we look at attachment 2, we can see that it is broken down into categories or domains. Those domains are broken down further into subcategories, or what they call on this attachment indicators. And within each indicator are a set of criteria on which we are going to evaluate that component of the program. For each of the indicators, we are going to measure the level of effectiveness of that component on a scale of 1 to 4. Where when we look at that indicator, a 1 means that no criteria has been met, and a 4 is the highest rating where all criteria have been met. The intermediate categories, a 2 means some criteria has been met, and a 3 would mean most of the criteria in that section has been met. So in domain 1, we are looking at the resident recruitment and selection. We talked about resident recruitment and selection in part 2 of this presentation. In part 2 of the presentation, you can see that I had slides where I pulled the criteria directly from this rubric into the presentation so that we can make sure that our framework for our program and our program design is based upon this rubric. But let's take a look at the indicators in domain 1, resident recruitment and selection. The first indicator is our recruitment practices. The second one is application identification. 3 are the predictor assessments, and 4 are the resident selection processes and criteria that we use to select our residents. So we discussed all of those in part 2 of the video series, and we will discuss further sections in these additional presentations. Domain 2 of attachment 2 is the residency design. We will evaluate the design of our residency and make sure that it meets the criteria outlined here in domain 2. We have not done a presentation on the residency design because, as I mentioned earlier, this is going to be a component that's going to be developed in the coming months by the Principal Resident Committee. But in Domain 2, it is important for the DEIC and campus and district leaders to understand this is the criteria on which the residency design framework should be built. There are 4 indicators in Domain 2, including residency design, residency quality, residency coaching, and residency supervision. In future presentations, we will also examine Domain 3 of Attachment 2 in more depth, and this has to do with the residency experiences. Those experiences will be a combination of things that residents experience in their program at the University of Texas Tyler and on the job in Kennedale ISD. The 4 indicators in this domain are authentic leadership opportunities, formative feedback, performance assessments, and culturally responsive pedagogy. In the grant performance measures that we've already discussed in this presentation, many of these grant performance measures are listed or described in Domain 4. Domain 4 of Attachment 2 are the residency completion performance outcomes. The 4 indicators are exit competencies, number 2, school district hiring, 3, job placement and retention in the long term, and number 4, job performance in the long term. That was a very quick overview of Attachment 2. Attachment 3 is very similar to Attachment 2, which will be used by the university. I want to remind everyone in Kennedale ISD and all of our stakeholders that our principal residents will do self-evaluations of the program and their experiences using those rubrics. I do want to recommend that our residents, our campus and district leaders, the members of the Principal Resident Committee, and the DEIC all become familiar with Attachment 2. Now I want to shift focus to Attachment 1 of the grant. I have not talked much about Attachment 1. Attachment 1 is a rubric that we had to do a pre-assessment activity for before applying for the grant. If you go to the TA Grants Opportunity page, you can find a blank copy of Attachment 1. However, on the screen you see that I have a copy that has been filled in on the right-hand side and is already a completed rubric. This is actually an attachment that we sent with the original Kennedale ISD Principal Residency Grant application for Cycle 3. TEA did require us to do a pre-assessment activity to see how well we were leveraged in our leadership readiness. So this is called the Attachment 1, Leverage Leadership Readiness. In this rubric, we had to do a pre-assessment on how well we did a couple of things. The first page here that you see is how well that we assessed our abilities to lead data-driven culture. And so it forced us to look at all of our processes, both at the campus and district levels, to see how well we could support our residents. So the question is, as you're examining this document, the question for the DEIC and campus and district leaders should be, how are we going to use this pre-assessment activity to evaluate our program effectiveness? And the primary answer, the best answer that I have for that question is that we should look at these scores. We should use this rubric again at the end of the grant cycle and at intermediate steps in between, perhaps at our quarterly benchmarks. We should look at this rubric to see how well we have improved throughout the year and throughout this grant cycle. The other thing that I recommend to the DEIC and campus and district leaders is that we take each of the indicators on this rubric to help design our residency design and our experiences for our residents. And we also need to take a hard look in the mirror to see areas where we scored ourselves low to improve our processes and our structures in Kennedale ISD before proceeding in 2020-21. In the second area of Attachment 1, where Kennedale ISD did a pre-assessment activity for the original grant application, Kennedale ISD looked at its current observation feedback systems. And so the question that I ask again is, how will we use this in our evaluation process? Well, to answer that, I want the campus and district leaders and the DEIC and the Principal Resident Program Committee to look at the indicators on this section of Attachment 1. There were definitely some areas where we initially assessed ourselves very high, but also some areas of opportunity. I think that the Principal Resident Committee should take a look at these areas of opportunity and all of these indicators and look at our current systems in Kennedale ISD and see where we can make improvements to prepare for the Principal Residency Program. And then on the back end, the DEIC should use this document in its evaluation processes to see the improvement that Kennedale ISD is having in supporting its administrative leaders. Now that we've looked at the grant performance measures and the major evaluation rubrics that the DEIC should use in the evaluation process, I want to look at some other considerations. And first, I will start with the Kennedale ISD needs assessment that was done prior to the grant. When we evaluate the effectiveness of this grant, I do need to take note at this point in the presentation that TA did not provide any other instruments for Kennedale ISD and the DEIC to evaluate the program. And so it will be the primary responsibility of the DEIC and campus and district leaders to develop the rubrics and the criteria which they are going to measure the other components of success. This is an example of one of those items that I'm talking about. Here we are looking at our needs assessment, and in part 1 of this video series, I outlined 3 quantifiable needs that were identified during the needs assessment process prior to us writing the grant. I want to shift our focus from the needs that were discussed to the right hand of the screen, which was the plan for addressing the need. The need here was for us to improve the diversity of our campus administrative positions. And in the needs assessment, we also had to, on the right-hand side again, we had to come up with a plan for addressing this need. We said that we would use a targeted recruiting and selection process. So when we look at this example and we look at other examples for the remainder of this presentation, DEIC members and campus and district leaders need to think about how are we going to measure whether or not that plan was successful. And so the DEIC, again, if I have members watching, they need to think about what kind of rubrics, what kind of evaluative materials they are going to use to see how well our plans were in addressing the needs that we had. And so let's just go through this example for just a minute. We could look at our targeted recruitment and selection process. When it's all said and done, we can look at our numbers. We did set targeted recruitment and selection goals. We wanted 3 of our 5 residents to be from our minority populations in this process. And so I think if we meet those criteria, then we could say that this was overall a successful program, at least in this aspect of our needs assessment. So this is one example, and we'll look at more of where the DEIC is going to have to make its own original criteria to evaluate the program. So along those same lines, we need to look at our second need in our needs assessment, which was to increase the number and quality of internal candidates for campus principal and AP positions. So the DEIC will need to look at, were we successful at developing internal leadership pipelines through full-time, year-long principal residencies? And finally, from our needs assessment, the DEIC will need to look to see how well we nurtured these campus leaders, how well we improved our retention rates, and how well our program created a pipeline for the future. At the forefront of our program evaluation should be our specific goals and benchmarks that we developed in the grant application. So let's take a look at how the DEIC could use our program goals in this evaluation. The Kennedale ISD, DEIC, and campus and district leaders should, in their development of evaluative processes and methods, keep our SMART goal in mind. When we constructed our SMART goal for the Principal Residency Grant for Cycle 3, we did consider the completion rates that were required in the grant performance measures. Therefore, we did set a goal for 100% of our residents to complete their coursework and obtain their master's degrees from UT Tyler, to complete their year-long residencies at Kennedale ISD, to pass their certification exams, to meet the requirements of PASL, and eventually and ultimately to receive their principal certificates by the end of the grant cycle, which is August of 2021. The KISD SMART Goal provides the DEIC and campus and district leaders another opportunity to evaluate the effectiveness of the program and the overall success of the program at the end of the grant cycle. However, I do want to remind all of our district leaders and the DEIC that we have some natural stages at which we should conduct program evaluations. One of those natural stages is at the end of the recruitment, application, and hiring stage. We did set a goal for our targeted recruitment efforts to place at least 3 of 5 or 60% of the applicants and ultimately the selected residents to be from our district's underrepresented minority populations. At the end of the hiring cycle, it is good time for the DEIC and campus and district leaders to reflect on those efforts and evaluate the effectiveness of that stage. Although there are some natural stages at the ends of which KISD leaders and DEIC members should conduct program evaluations, there are also some formal quarterly benchmarks that must be conducted to measure progress of the program. In the original grant application, KISD established quarterly benchmarks. The DEIC will be responsible for conducting formal quarterly evaluations of the program based upon these benchmarks. I've listed first quarter benchmarks that we included in this grant in gold. You can see that we established 7 benchmarks for the first quarter to monitor the program's early success. These benchmarks include ensuring residents are selected and placed on campuses, ensuring that residents complete summer coursework at UT Tyler, ensuring residents attend the TEA and KISD Summer Institutes, ensuring residents are assigned a mentor, and ensuring residents obtain certifications needed to perform appraisals duties early in the year. It is the responsibility of the DEIC for evaluating the early program success. In the second quarter, which is in the fall of 2020, the DEIC will need to ensure that all KISD principal residents enroll in and complete their fall coursework at UT Tyler, and that includes the Practicum 1. They will also need to ensure that principal residents conduct their beginning of the year and middle of the year TPES conferences with their appraisers. They will also need to make sure that all of the principal residents were given a site mentor and that those site mentors are working collaboratively with field supervisors to ensure a rigorous clinical experience with a focus on instructional coaching is in place at each campus. The DEIC will need to ensure that all KISD principal residents have weekly meetings with their mentors. And also, all of the principal residents are going to be required to maintain weekly logs. Those are going to be used for reflection and to provide informal and formal feedback to their field supervisors, mentors, and the DEIC. And finally, in the second quarter, the DEIC will need to ensure that all KISD principal residents, in collaboration with their campus mentors and field supervisors, begin their action research projects. The third quarter benchmarks include benchmarks that we want for the spring of 2021, but also some of the program end goals that occur in summer of 2021. The DEIC will need to ensure that all KISD principal residents meet with their field supervisors and mentor to discuss any obstacles from previous quarters and develop remediation strategies to ensure a continuation of high-quality clinical experiences. Eventually, the DEIC will need to ensure that the residents are making adequate progress in the spring and throughout the summer to complete their coursework for the required master's degree program with principal certification at UT Tyler. And then after the end of the spring, the committee will need to ensure that principal residents complete practicums 1 and 2 and complete their action research projects with their presentations to the campus leadership teams. The committee DEIC will also need to ensure that all KISD principal residents attend HumanX Ventures training in that second half of their residency experience to become a HumanX teacher interviewer. And then the DEIC will need to ensure that all KISD principal residents attend instructional coaching training at Region 11 or from another qualified provider. The DEIC will need to ensure that all of the residents collect, upload, and submit the required artifacts, plan student work, and feedback for PASL. Just a note here, that should be relatively easy since they are doing a lot of their hours for the practicum and for these projects on the job. And finally, at the end of the third quarter and towards the end of the year, the committee needs to ensure that KISD principal residents take and pass the Texas Principal 268 exam, meet the minimum standards of PASL, apply for and obtain the Texas Principal as an Instructional Leader certification from the state of Texas. In part 3 of this program, I've tried to provide an overview of the evaluation process and the role of the DEIC and district and campus leaders in evaluating the KISD Principal Residency Grant Program for 2020-21. However, I do want to reinforce that it is very important for DEIC members and campus and district leaders to read the grant guidelines, to read the grant application, to read all of the attachments, to understand the full scope and nature of the evaluation process and all of the things that are involved. I do want to make sure that all campus and district leaders and DEIC members consider the grant assurances and grant requirements, the grant evaluation rubrics, the grant performance measures, the KISD needs assessment that went into this grant, and the goals and benchmarks that were listed by KISD in the grant application. If you have questions regarding the grant, you can contact Chad G., KISD Superintendent. However, if you have specific questions about the DEIC, I recommend that you contact Dr. Julie Vu, the KISD Assistant Superintendent. If you have questions about the UT Tyler Graduate Program, I recommend that you contact Dr. Wes Hickey or Practicum Supervisors Dr. Gary Miller or Dr. Kathy Ray. This concludes Part 3 of our presentation.